Chapter 3. 1 year had passed since I had closed that hatch after bringing Sky, Billy, and Stephen, and now we are in trouble. Late one evening, Stephen discovered that the deep freeze was now beginning to thaw out, and that's when I noticed that the air in the tomb started tasting stale. After checking in the supply room, I realized that all the solar batteries were dead, and we had run out of fuel for the generator nearly 6 months prior. All that I could figure out was that something topside had taken out our solar panels on the surface, and now we only had enough oxygen to last approximately 2 days. And after deliberating with the group for nearly 3 hours, we decided to chance the possible radioactive world and go topside. These shelters were designed to sustain life up to 10 years, but now we had no choice but to pop open the hatch. The radiation level on the surface above was a big concern to me, since I knew 1 year was not enough for the natural depletion of the radioactive material. So I informed the group the following morning that I would be the only one going topside. I had to check on the solar panels, see if I could salvage or repair them. After all, one person sick from radiation poisoning was far much better than 4. But this news did not go over well with the group as I had hoped it would. Over the past year together underground, I had developed a great relationship with the group, especially Sky. We had developed a tight bond between us. Nothing intimate, but we pretty much grew inseparable. After arguing with the group for nearly an hour, I had to ignore their votes and instill dictatorship for the first time in the tomb. I had no death wish I was in a hurry to complete, but someone had to go topside and fix the problem before we all suffocated. And since this was my own shelter, I was the only one qualified to work on the solar panels. It was my responsibility. Suffocating is a horrible way to die, especially dying down here. After gathering a small assortment of tools from the generator room, I placed them in a small tool bag and proceeded up the tunnel. Before I popped open the hatch, I looked down below me and saw Sky standing at the bottom, looking up at me. I hollered down to her and assured her everything was going to be all right. Then I popped open the hatch. Darkness. What the hell? Somehow down in the tomb, we had a complete misconception of time. This was no big deal, but it was a surprise to say the least. It took at least 20 minutes to clear the 5 acres of overgrowth that surrounded the entrance of the tomb. And to see all the plant life was another surprise to me. But right now my mission was to find those solar panels. Finally, after what seemed like forever, I reached the area the solar panels once stood. But they were not there. No panels, no brackets, no poles, nothing. Everything was gone. While searching the immediate area for a trace as to where the panels went, a light drizzle began to fall from the night sky. And as it fell on my bare arms, it began to sting. The more I was in it, the more it burned. It felt like a swarm of bees were attacking me. Since the house was much closer than the tomb, I ran for cover inside it. I entered my home through the kitchen door, quickly stripped off my clothes, and rinsed off using the kitchen sink. Thankfully, water was still working. My bare skin was red all over from what appears to be burns I had sustained from the rain. I went upstairs to the master bedroom, put on a change of clothes and a fresh pair of boots, then walked back down the stairs to the living room. My house was a mess. It appeared as if someone had ransacked it in search for food and valuables, and the more I looked around, the more I got pissed off. Somebody broke into my home. I began to search through the debris, but I could not tell how long the house was last visited by intruders. But it had to be recent since the solar batteries in the tomb were dead, and that gave me a timeline of 2 weeks since the solar panels had been removed. And due to the trash and the panels missing, it meant that there was human traffic on the surface. So maybe the nuclear fallout was not as severe as I had expected, and the war was over. It took about another 20 minutes for the burning rain to pass, and once it stopped, I went back to the shelter to inform the group about my discoveries. But by the time I reached the entrance of the tomb, my body was overwhelmed with painful convulsions. My head was pounding and thumping with headaches. Several times I nearly passed out just trying to reach the tomb. And now climbing down the tunnel, I was on the verge of blacking out. By the time I finally reached the floor of the main room, my body was consumed with fever, and I collapsed onto the floor. I remained in and out of consciousness for 3 days, and on the 4th day I awoke to a man and woman's voice in a heated argument. It took a moment for my eyes to focus and adjust to the light emanating from oil lamps that were burning inside the tomb, and it took a while for me to sit upright in the bunk someone had placed me in. My forearms were wrapped in gauze and ointment. A vain attempt to treat the burns, but other resources were limited. There was still pain in my arms and back, but it was mild considering the pain I felt 4 days prior. I still could not make out the argument that was going on, but it was Billy and Sky that were having it. After gathering up my strength, I got up out of bed and walked to the cooking area where they were, and they immediately stopped their bickering and turned their attention towards me. Sky was the first to ask how I was feeling, but Billy cut me off before I could answer and asked me what had happened on the surface. After assuring Sky that I was all right, I told Billy about the rain I had encountered that burned me, and then told him about the missing solar panels and the ransacked house. He quickly came up with the same conclusion as I did. Someone was alive topside, and although there was highly concentrated acid rain in the area, the surface was able to sustain life. But the war was far from over. Before I could ask what he meant, Billy turned on the portable radio, and for the first time in a year, there were voices coming from the speaker. I became excited at first, but it was short-lived once I listened to the words. It was military propaganda, kind of like the ones they used back in Vietnam, and it was calling every American citizen and military personnel out of hiding. But it wasn't our military on the waves. We had been invaded. This is what Billy and Sky were arguing about. She wanted to go topside, turn herself into the authorities, and get me sufficient medical treatment, but Billy refused to let her leave the tomb, and that's what they were fighting over. Although I was sick, and she meant well, I was glad Billy did not let her leave. He knew just as I did what would happen if she would have made contact on the surface. The radio broadcast was good. They promised food, shelter, and medical treatment. But unfortunately, that never happened. Anyone foolish enough to turn themselves in would be herded into some type of concentration camp, and would be promised better treatment if they gave them locations where others were hiding. And this late in the war, anyone who turned up at a camp had once or still has affiliations or known location of civilian holdups. A foreign military power would consider them a militia. They would not get a trial or jail time. Instead, 9 times out of 10, they would have been killed. I could tell Sky cared for me, but now with the enlightenment of our situation, I just couldn't allow myself to get involved. And I told her that I was extremely grateful that she was willing to do anything to help me, but under no circumstances did I ever want her to put herself in jeopardy. I knew she meant well and did not fully understand the consequences of her leaving would cause, but we could not take any chances like that, especially now. And after changing the dressings on my wounds, I sat down at the table with the others, and we discussed our situation one last time. With the solar panels gone, the air and water purifier, hot water heater, and refrigerator was dead. And without gas for the generator, we had no cooking equipment. We had enough food for about 2 more years if we rationed it. But if we stayed in here, the hatch would have to stay open so we would not suffocate. But the 40-foot tunnel made it difficult for fresh air to circulate down to us. We discussed the power situation, and since we were unsure of the scale of military presence in the area, it would be foolish to go into town for supplies. Hell, even if there was a town left. And after talking about our situation, the realization that we needed to leave the tomb fell heavy on us. Next came the task of deciding where to go if we did leave the tomb. And Stephen came up with an idea of moving into my house and hiding out there. But that was not an option since somebody, possibly the military, had already been there once before. But this gave Stephen fuel for his idea. Since they had already searched the house once, they would not come back. But Billy stepped in and told him that since they recovered the solar panels from this location, that they might come back to see if they can salvage anything else. That's when Sky suggested her brother's cabin, some 60 miles away in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Her brother had died in the Gulf War back in the early 90s, and the cabin remained in her family as a vacation spot. And after taking some boats, we all agreed to chance the trip to the mountains. But getting there was going to be another problem. Our vehicles had been sitting outside for a year, and there was a slim chance that any of them would start. So I gave Sky and Stephen the task of collecting supplies and gear, as Billy and I went topside to inspect the vehicles. Oh man, was I happy to see my car again, but it was also painful. To see what that acid rain had done to my paint job within 1 year. I opened the driver's side door and got in. I then slid the key into the ignition, pumped the gas pedal 3 times, and prayed to the car gods that she would crank. I turned the key, and to my surprise, the gods were smiling on me. The engine turned over, and the glass pack exhaust exploded with life. But the truck's battery was dead, so we had to jump it off with my vehicle. We then drove both vehicles to the last 5 acres of my property and got out. That's when the thermostat in the truck opened up, and watered-down antifreeze began to pour out of the engine block. Apparently, the winter on the surface was cold enough to crack the engine block in the pickup truck, so we are now down to just one vehicle. But one is better than none. By the time Billy and me got back into the tomb, Sky and Steven had already finished packing up all the supplies and survival gears as I had instructed. But for my own peace of mind, I went through every duffel bag and rechecked the supplies. After sending the bags up by rope, I retrieved 2 M4 rifles and 4 ammunition clips and gave them to Billy with instructions to keep them in the front seat of the Chevelle. I put Steven and Sky in the back seat, then motioned Billy to follow me a few yards from the vehicle so we could talk without alarming the others. Billy had several more years in the military than I had, and with his experience as an Army Ranger, it made taking opinions and suggestions from him much easier. After walking about 20 yards, I asked Billy what he thought about our situation, but he did not answer my question. Instead, he asked me if I thought we'd run into trouble before we got into the mountains. I was not sure if we would or not. That's why I wanted him in the front seat with me in case we did hit a military roadblock. I told him that I would try to stay on the back roads as much as possible to avoid any foreign military, but eventually we would have to go through a few small towns along the way before we reached the mountains. He stood there for a minute, as if he was thinking hard on our plan to escape to the mountains. Then he turned towards me and said, "You know that even if we do make it to the mountains, we're only prolonging the outcome." The outcome I thought he was speaking about was no matter what we did, we would be caught. And if we were lucky, we would only get sent to a camp and not killed. I looked at him with disgust. How could a former Army Ranger be willing to give up so easily early in this fight? Billy, if you're going to be traveling with us, I need to be able to depend on you to go all the way, and to never give up on us. He was extremely offended and quickly snapped back. "I would never do anything to jeopardize the group, let alone the life of my son. I'm just making sure that you are aware of the risk and difficulties we will be facing, and that in time, the military will come across us sooner or later. It might be accidental, but it will come. It will happen." After this, I did apologize for doubting his loyalty to the group. Then we walked back to the car where Billy made the suggestions of giving Steven a weapon for the trip. Stopping at the trunk of the car, I gave him a questioning look, but he quickly explained by saying that if we might need him if the plan turned south. I agreed, so I opened up the trunk and pulled out one of the shotguns and a box of shells, handed them to Steven, and we're all back in the car and drove across the yard onto the road. After a few hours of driving down the back roads and small towns in the dead of the night, we finally made it to one of the old log cabins. It was built deep in the mountains, and the only way to get there was by an old washed-out logging trail that had not been used in about 12 years. This thing would have been much easier to travel on if we would have had the truck, but we did finally make it in one piece. And after unloading the vehicle, I parked it underneath some low-hanging branches at the edge of the woods that surrounded the cabin, and went inside and lay down in one of the 3 bedrooms and quickly fell asleep. After sleeping the rest of the night away, I was abruptly wakened by an explosion right outside. I jumped up out of bed and grabbed my rifle and ran through the bedroom doorway, accidentally hitting my arm on the door jamb, causing a brief but intense pain, which almost caused me to yell it out, but I continued to move through the cabin until I was outside. This is where I witnessed Billy snatching the shotgun I gave Steven last night away from his son. Still holding my rifle in the ready position, I asked Billy what was going on, but seeing the ripped-up bloody mess that Steven was holding answered me. Steven had shot a rabbit with 3-inch Magnum double-up buckshot, and now all what was left could fit in the palm of his hands. After flipping my safety on my rifle, I looked at Billy, who now looked as if he could rip off his son's head, and said to him, "Take it easy on him, Billy. He didn't know." But Steven jumped in, still thinking he did nothing wrong. "Didn't know what? We haven't had any meat to eat in days, and I had a guaranteed kill on that rabbit." Before I could answer him, Billy raised his hand, signaling me that he was going to take care of it. Then turned to Steven and explained that by firing this close to the cabin, it was possible to draw unwanted attention to our location, and when we decided to go on hunting trips for food, we would have to travel away from the cabin, and that way, if there was anyone around, they would not get an easy fix on the cabin. I did not know if this vital information sunk into Stephen's head, but I left the two outside to have their father-son squabble, and walked back inside and went to the bathroom to check my arm that I hit. The gauze was now blood-soaked. We did not have electricity in this cabin, or running water, so I lit an oil lamp and sat it on the bathroom cabinet and discovered that someone had already filled the wash bucket. After removing the gauze from my right arm, I used my free hand to splash cold water from the wash bucket, washing the blood from the wound so I can examine the damage. To my relief, it felt a lot worse than it was. When I had hit my arm on the door jamb, it has caused the new skin that was healing to rip open. And after making sure the bleeding had stopped, I turned to leave the bathroom but was met with Sky in the doorway. With concern in her eyes, she asked me what was wrong. I told her there was nothing to worry about, just Stephen shooting some rabbits outside. Ben, I'm not talking about John Wayne outside. I'm talking about your arm. I told her that I was just changing the dressing on and that my arm was fine. She looked at me in disbelief, then said that the gauze and med kit was in her room. John Wayne, I asked sarcastically, as I followed her into the room. Now all you need to do is give Billy a nickname and you have all of us covered. Oh, I have his covered. Really? It's Stick in the Mud. Stick in the Mud? Yes, I know he's a little stiff and rough around the edges at times, but really, a stick in the mud? Shit, he's so stiff, as a suit drenched in starch and hung out to dry, she said with a giggle, and I could not help but laugh with her. She always seemed to bring the best out of me. I sat down on the edge of bed beside her, as she put antibiotic cream on my arm and started to wrap it up with fresh gauze. You know, Ben, we haven't had any time to talk. What do you mean? We talk all the time. You know what I mean. We've been locked down that God-forsaken hole in the ground for a whole year. And although I've caught you looking, you never made a move. And before she could finish, Billy interrupted and asked if he could see me outside as soon as possible. Sky had already finished bandaging up my arm, and I sat up from the bed and walked towards the bedroom door. I heard her mumble, "Yep, stick in the mud." I stopped at the doorway, turned back, and walked back towards the bed where she was sitting. She still looked as beautiful as the first day I met her, and with throwing caution to the wind, I ran the backside of my hand down the side of her face and gently kissed her on her lips. She didn't resist me, as I knew she wouldn't. Not because I thought of myself as Don Juan, but because I knew she felt the same as I did, and I told her that we'd talk later. She acknowledged me by nodding her head. Then I walked outside to see what the hell Billy wanted. By the time I got outside, Billy and Stephen were knelt down at the edge of the property, near the old logging trail. As I walked towards them, I could see they were examining tracks, and by the way Stephen was squirming, I expected him to be deer or some other big game track. But when I got closer to them, Billy got up, turned to me and saying, "Ben, we got a problem. Take a look at those tracks, and tell me what you see." I knelt down beside Stephen and examined the old clay road. But it only took a tenth of a second to realize they were not tracking animals. There, imprinted into the clay road, were traces of multiple boot impressions. And after an hour of examining the road and surrounding area, I discovered that all the boot imprints carried the same identical tread pattern, but ranged in different sizes, which left me with the conclusion that they were left by some sort of military patrol. And from judging by the conditions of the track and quantity, I decided that they were about 3 days old and were left by a squad the size of 10 to 15 men. Billy was right. We did have a problem. There was no way we could take a chance of staying here at this cabin when there was a squad patrolling this part of the mountain. After searching the road for another 30 minutes, my worries were not lifted. I found many old tracks from the same patrol, which led me to believe that they were patrolling this area quite often. Then I went into the woodlands and studied the area the patrol exited and entered as they crossed the road, paying close attention to the plant life that had regrown, and after inspecting broken branches, trampled decaying plant life, I was able to put together a rough estimate timeline on their patrols. It appeared to me that they were recycling their patrols every 3 to 4 weeks, and that meant we only had about 18 days before the patrol returned to the cabin. I walked over to where Billy was standing and told him what I had learned from the tracks, and especially what the timeline was before the patrol would return. Yeah, I figured it was patrol about 12 men myself, but I don't see I can tell when they'll be coming back by those tracks. I had a tremendous amount of respect towards Billy. He was a good man, a great soldier, and he knew his stuff. I could just tell by listening to him talk. But I could not pass up the opportunity to wisecrack on him every now and then. I looked over at him with a shit-eating grin and said, "Well, Billy, as a Marine sniper, I was trained to study troop movement, then plan an attack on their routine, using their timetable against them. Unlike the great Army Rangers, who stumble on a platoon of men and play Rambo, wasting truckloads of ammunition trying to kill just one man." Kiss my ass, jarhead. I could not help but laugh. Sky was right. He was a stick in the mud. But in his defense, he had a good reason to be. I could tell Billy was on edge with the thought of patrol soldiers scouring the mountainside. I watched him for a few hours as he walked around outside, staring off into the woods. Sky had concerns that he was about to leave the group in fear of being caught by the patrol. But I knew better. He was not on the verge of running. As I watched him, I finally realized what he was doing. He was scouting the nearby area for a quick escape route, but that's where his fault lied. He was looking for a way out, too close to the cabin, but at least he was trying to think ahead. After dinner, I walked outside to talk to him alone. I asked him what he was thinking about, and he answered me with a question. "You do know that the shit is going to really hit the fan if they find us here." "Yes, Bill, I'm aware of that. That's why I'm leaving tonight. I'm going to go try to find a safer spot for us away from this mountain patrol." This sparked Billy's interest. He turned from the woods and faced me and said, "I'm going with you. You're going to need my help if you run into a patrol." "No, Billy. I need you here in case the patrol comes back early. I need someone here that I can depend on to get Sky and your son out safely." Billy was about to challenge my decision, but knew I would not back down. Then I told him I needed him to do this without questions. He then looked at me and said, Well, it looks like democracy finally went out the window around here. Now we know who's in charge." In a situation like this, we did need someone in charge. And although Billy had more years in the service of the military, and older than me, he had never been put in charge of running his own operation. I, on the other hand, had countless military special operations under my belt, in which I had to operate and execute, and Billy was aware of this, and that is why he stopped arguing with me and offered to help pack my gear. Despite Sky's remarkable cooking abilities, we were all getting tired of eating canned food, and the nagging thought of the military presence on the mountain had pretty much eliminated any appetite for dinner, so I excused myself from the dinner table and went to the back bedroom to pack my gear that I was going to need for my reconnaissance mission. I was not sure if I was going to run into patrol of troops or not, so I packed my military-issue Alice pack with 20 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition and 3 ammunition clips for my M4. If I ran into trouble, I figured I could handle it with this combination of my sniper rifle and assault rifle. I also packed a few MREs and a couple 20-ounce bottles of water. I tried to keep the weight down so I could cover more terrain without exhausting myself. So the last thing I packed was a military poncho to provide protection from the hot rain I might encounter, and my ghillie suit, which I rolled up like a sleeping bag and strapped onto the back of my backpack. A ghillie suit is a sniper's best friend for any covert mission. It's a full-body camouflage suit that is made up of burlap, cloth, and canvas material that is cut up, arranged, and sewn into place to break the silhouette of a sniper. Makes them blend into the bush around them. Even though this suit weighed about 20 pounds, it is an invaluable asset, and I would need it if I ran into a patrol. After packing everything in my backpack, I got dressed in my old Woodland BDUs. Most people would have been overwhelmed by the pressure and situation I was in, but not me. As I stood there in the room, I looked at my reflection in the mirror by the light coming from the oil lamp. I applied my green and black camouflage face paint, and I put on my Woodland boonie hat. There was still a tremendous sense of pride and confidence that came over me. I could not help but think of the old saying, "Everything happens for a reason," and this was true. I was well trained by the Marines to survive in some of the worst hostile terrain and situations known to man. I was highly qualified to get my friends out of harm's way. I stepped back from the mirror, grabbed my pack and weapons, and walked back to the front room of the cabin where the rest of the group was. Unfortunately, when I entered the room, Sky stood up and started the protest. "We are going with you, Ben. You said everyone had a vote in all decisions. We decided to go with you. Great. My first day in power, and now I have to deal with a freaking mutiny. But the humor in my statement was not seen by the group, especially by Skye, who had now crossed her arm across her chest and was now staring down at me. I looked over at Billy for help in explaining why this had to be done this way, but all he did was shook his head left to right and gestured with his hands in a way of saying no reasoning with her. And Stephen, well, it's definitely no help. He was still gun-ho from this morning, and was all excited with the idea of running around the woods, playing war. But we were not playing war. But we were not playing a game. This was not some game of paintball out here in the woods. This was serious shit we were dealing with. During this past year, we were all together. Never once have I ever argued with Skye or the others, let alone raised my voice in anger. But now I had no choice but to get very short and rough with them. So with a stern commanding voice, as if I was addressing a platoon, I said, "This is not up for debate, people. Situations have changed. Due to these changes, this has to be done my way. Billy understands the urgency of this reconnaissance mission, and I expect you two to also accept it." Oh, but this did not have the desired effect I wanted. As a matter of fact, it made things worse, and Skye was pissed now. "All right, mister, you listen to me. This is not the military. We are not your soldiers. You can take your orders and stick 'em up your ass." Then she stormed past me and went towards the bedrooms in the back of the cabin, and slammed the door shut. I set all my gear down and walked back towards the room and knocked on the door. When I opened the door, I stepped in. I could tell she was mad. "Listen, Skye, I am fully aware that this is not the military. I'm not trying to order anyone around. It's just that I have a short timeline to find a safe place for us, and to accomplish that, I need to go alone." But it soon became clear to me she was not mad about being told what to do. Tears began to roll down her face when she said, "Billy said that you might run into those soldiers while you're out scouting. And if you did, he said he did not care if you had been in the Marines. You couldn't stop a whole patrol of men by yourself." She was really upset and could not stop crying, so I had to interrupt her before she could finish. Hey, nothing's going to happen to me, okay? I promise. If I run into a patrol, I will turn around, hightail it right back here, all right?" She wrapped her arms around me and rested her head against my chest. "Just please be careful, Ben. I've already lost my brother to a bullet in a war. I don't want to lose you that way." I stood there holding her for what seemed like hours. When she had finally calmed down, I reassured her that nothing was going to happen to me. Everything was going to be all right. Then, in an attempt to lighten up the mood, I said, "Hey, if anything happens to me, I've been assured you'll be taken care of." Did Billy say that?" "Well, no, but I'm sure Stephen would love to try." "Oh, yeah. Here my arm hurt before. She waylaid into me, yelling and cussing at me. I tried not to laugh, but it worked." She was now smiling again. When I returned to the front room of the cabin, I told Billy while I was gone I wanted him to teach Skye and Stephen how to travel in the woods without leaving tracks. I knew this was a huge and difficult request, but it would be necessary when we left. I knew that they would all be safe until I got back. But just as a safety precaution, I wanted someone pulling sentry duty at all times during the night. After putting on my gear, I headed towards the door. Billy tossed me a pack of cigarettes and a lighter. "Just don't leave your butts laying around." I just nodded, and I left the cabin. That is the end of Chapter 3.